The internet has seen plenty of political feuds, but this one has reached a level where every new post feels like pouring gasoline on an already burning fire. Candace Owens has now reportedly erupted after Erika Kirk pulled her husband into the middle of an already explosive public dispute, turning what started as online accusations into a full-scale media storm that's spreading across social platforms at lightning speed. What makes this situation so volatile isn't just the personalities involved. It's the way every statement is being dissected, clipped, and reshared within minutes, each side accusing the other of distortion, manipulation, and bad faith storytelling. Candace is pushing back hard, claiming she's being misrepresented and dragged into narratives she says she never made, while Erika's side is allegedly framing Candace's commentary as part of a broader pattern of attacks that go beyond criticism and into personal territory. But the real shock for audiences is the escalation. It's no longer just about disagreements or political commentary. Now family members, private reputations, and past personal histories are being pulled into the spotlight, creating a situation where the lines between public debate and personal warfare are completely blurred. And as if that wasn't enough, new claims, screenshots, and alleged receipts are being circulated online every few hours, each one adding another layer of confusion to an already messy timeline. Supporters on both sides are digging in deeper, refusing to back down, and turning comment sections into battlegrounds of competing narratives. So the question now isn't just what was said, but how far this is going to escalate before someone finally decides to step away from the fire. To understand why this situation has exploded the way it has, you have to go back and look at the larger ecosystem it's coming from. This isn't just one argument between two public figures. It's the result of years of political commentary culture, turning into a non-stop feedback loop where every claim is instantly amplified, dissected, and weaponized online. Candace Owens has built her public identity around confrontation. Whether she's discussing politics, media narratives, or cultural issues, she rarely stays in neutral territory. Her commentary style is direct, provocative, and designed to challenge mainstream interpretations. That approach has earned her a strong, loyal audience, but it has also placed her at the center of frequent controversy, especially when her statements intersect with sensitive personal or institutional topics. Erika Kirk, on the other hand, is primarily known through her connection to Charlie Kirk and the broader Turning Point USA network. After Charlie's death, Erika's public role shifted significantly, moving her from a more private figure into someone constantly observed, discussed, and interpreted by both supporters and critics of the organization. That transition alone placed her under a level of scrutiny that most private individuals never experience, where every appearance, interview, or statement is analyzed for hidden meaning. The tension between these worlds began when commentary around Fusa and its internal culture started circulating more aggressively online. Allegations, rumors, and insider claims began appearing across social media platforms, with different influencers and commentators interpreting the same events in completely opposite ways. In that environment, even small statements can become major flashpoints, because audiences are already primed to see conflict everywhere. Candace Owens positioned herself as someone questioning narratives that she believes are being selectively framed or politically filtered. Erika Kirk's response, according to the way it is being discussed online, is rooted in defending personal reputation and protecting the legacy of her late husband. Those two positions are fundamentally incompatible in tone. One is investigative and confrontational, the other is defensive and protective. This is where the conflict starts to intensify. Once family members enter the conversation, even indirectly, the emotional weight changes completely. What might have remained a political disagreement quickly becomes personal, because references to spouses, private communications, or character judgments are no longer abstract talking points. They carry emotional consequences, public perception consequences, and reputational consequences that extend far beyond social media. At the same time, the digital environment is accelerating everything. Platforms reward engagement, not accuracy. A single clipped video, out-of-context screenshot, or heavily interpreted post can reach millions within hours. Once that happens, both sides feel pressure to respond immediately, not carefully. And every response then becomes fuel for the next cycle of interpretation. Supporters on both sides are not just passive observers. They actively participate in shaping the narrative. They amplify statements that confirm their beliefs and dismiss anything that contradicts them. This creates two parallel realities, one where Candace is exposing hidden truths, and another where Erika is being unfairly targeted and misrepresented. Neither side fully acknowledges the other's framing, which makes resolution increasingly unlikely. What makes this particular situation stand out is how quickly it moved from commentary into personal implication. The moment family members and private relationships became part of the discussion, the stakes shifted. It is no longer just about disagreeing with ideas. It is about defending identity, reputation, and emotional boundaries in a highly public space. And once a conflict reaches that stage online, it rarely slows down on its own. It escalates until either one side disengages or a new development forces a reset. Right now, neither of those things has happened, which is exactly why the situation continues to grow with every passing hour. As the online tension continued building, what started as commentary and counter-commentary quickly evolved into something much sharper. A direct, personal conflict where every new claim wasn't just debated, it was dissected for motive, timing, and hidden meaning. The turning point came when Erika Kirk's responses to the ongoing criticism began to expand beyond general defense and started focusing more specifically on Candace Owens and her husband being pulled into the wider narrative. At first, the dispute still looked like a typical social media clash, public figures disagreeing over interpretation, tone, and alleged misrepresentation. But that framing collapsed the moment personal relationships were mentioned in the same breath as political commentary. Once that line was crossed, the conversation stopped being about what was said and became about why it was said and who is really being targeted. Candace Owens, in her own framing of the situation, pushed back strongly against what she described as distortion. Her position centered on the idea that her statements were being selectively interpreted and then repackaged in a way that made them appear more extreme than intended. That kind of pushback is not new in her public career. But this time the response from the opposing side didn't stay limited to rebuttals or clarifications. Instead, it escalated into a broader narrative about intent, influence, and alleged coordination behind the criticism she was receiving. Erika Kirk's side of the conflict, as it was being discussed across social platforms, leaned heavily into the idea of personal harm and reputational damage. The inclusion of Candace's husband in the conversation, whether directly or indirectly depending on interpretation, was the moment everything shifted. It transformed the argument from public disagreement into personal intrusion, and that shift is what triggered the first major twist in the story. Once personal boundaries are perceived to have been crossed in public discourse, the reaction is rarely measured. It becomes reactive, emotional, and highly strategic at the same time. Both sides began reinforcing their positions more aggressively. Candace's supporters framed her as someone being targeted for speaking out and refusing to back down. Erika's supporters framed her as someone defending dignity and pushing back against what they saw as escalating provocation. But underneath the public statements, a deeper dynamic was forming. Neither side trusted the other's interpretation of events anymore. Every clarification was seen as manipulation. Every denial was seen as evasion. Every screenshot was treated like partial evidence rather than full context. That erosion of trust is what turned this from a dispute into a sustained conflict. The first real twist in the narrative came with the realization that this wasn't just a two-person disagreement. Additional voices began entering the conversation: commentators, influencers, and alleged insiders, each adding new fragments of information that didn't always align. Some posts claimed there were internal tensions being exposed publicly. Others suggested that the situation was being exaggerated for engagement. And others insisted that what was happening was part of a broader pattern of coordinated online targeting. The result wasn't clarity, it was fragmentation. Instead of one clear storyline, the audience was now watching multiple competing versions of the same events unfold simultaneously. And because each version was being presented with confidence and emotional intensity, audiences naturally split into factions. This is where the conflict took on a new shape. It stopped being a direct exchange between Candace Owens and Erika Kirk and became a layered information battle where interpretation mattered more than facts. A single sentence could be read in completely opposite ways depending on prior bias. A single clip could be framed as evidence or manipulation depending on who shared it first. Candace's response strategy, as perceived by supporters, was to challenge what she saw as inaccuracies and push for accountability in how narratives were being constructed. But critics argued that her involvement in the discourse added fuel to an already volatile environment, making it harder to separate legitimate criticism from personal escalation. Meanwhile, Erika's position became increasingly defensive in tone. The emphasis shifted toward protecting personal boundaries and challenging what she viewed as unfair targeting. The mention of family members, particularly her husband, was seen by her supporters as a red line that should not have been crossed in public discourse at all. That emotional framing intensified the reaction on her side of the audience, who began to interpret the situation not just as disagreement, but as an ongoing attack. The first twist deepened further when older statements, unrelated past interactions, and previously forgotten posts were pulled back into circulation. In modern online conflicts, nothing stays buried permanently. Once attention spikes, the entire historical archive of a person's online presence becomes relevant again, regardless of context or timing. This resurfacing of past material added new fuel to both sides. Supporters of Candace argued that old clips were being weaponized to create a false narrative. Supporters of Erika argued that the resurfaced content revealed a consistent pattern that could not be ignored. Neither side accepted the other's framing, which only widened the divide. At this stage, the conflict was no longer about isolated claims, it was about interpretation of character. And once a debate shifts into character interpretation, resolution becomes extremely difficult, because there is no single piece of evidence that can definitively settle perception. The audience itself also became part of the story. Comment sections turned into active battlegrounds, with users debating timelines, motives, and alleged contradictions. Each new post triggered another wave of analysis, and each wave made the situation more emotionally charged. The first major twist, therefore, is not a single revelation. It is the collapse of a shared narrative space. There is no longer one agreed-upon version of events. Instead, there are competing realities, each reinforced by selective evidence and emotional alignment. And as the conflict moved deeper into that fractured space, one thing became clear. The situation was no longer contained by the original disagreement. It had evolved into something much larger, where perception itself had become the main battleground, and every new statement only pushed the divide further apart. As the disagreement intensified, the situation stopped behaving like a normal online controversy and started resembling a constantly expanding pressure system. Every new post, reply, and leaked screenshot adding weight until the entire narrative structure began to strain. What made this phase different was not just the volume of claims, but the speed at which they mutated as they moved through different audiences. At this stage, neither side was responding in isolation anymore. Every statement was immediately filtered through supporters, critics, and third-party commentators who were actively reshaping the meaning in real time. A clarification became a contradiction. A denial became proof of pressure. A deleted post became evidence of cover-up. The escalation wasn't driven by one event, it was driven by interpretation spiraling out of control. Candace Owens' side of the narrative, as it was being circulated online, framed her responses as a pushback against coordinated misrepresentation. Her supporters pointed to inconsistencies in how certain claims were being repeated and amplified, arguing that context was being stripped away intentionally to create a more dramatic story. In their view, this wasn't just a disagreement, it was a targeted effort to distort her statements and associate her with claims she had not explicitly made. On the other side, Erika Kirk's supporters framed the situation very differently. For them, the issue was not interpretation but impact. They argued that regardless of intent, the spread of commentary and insinuation was causing real emotional and reputational damage. Once Candace's husband was brought into the broader conversation, whether through direct mention, implication, or audience interpretation, the stakes escalated dramatically. The conflict was no longer abstract. It had entered personal territory that audiences treat with far more intensity. The shocking reveal phase of this narrative did not come from a single confirmed fact. Instead, it emerged from a flood of secondary claims and counterclaims that created the impression of hidden structure beneath the visible conflict. Screenshots began circulating that allegedly showed internal disagreements, private frustrations, and off-platform exchanges between people connected to both sides. None of these materials were independently verified in the conversation, but in the attention economy, verification often lags far behind virality. What made these leaks so powerful was not their authenticity, but their timing. They appeared precisely when the audience was already primed to believe that something deeper was going on. That psychological readiness is what transforms ordinary online disputes into reveal moments, where every new piece of information is interpreted as confirmation of a larger hidden narrative. As these alleged leaks spread, both camps doubled down. Candace's supporters interpreted them as manufactured or selectively edited content designed to provoke outrage. Erika's supporters interpreted them as overdue exposure of what they believed had been happening behind the scenes. The same material was being used to support completely opposite conclusions, which further reinforced the split reality already forming around the conflict. The escalation also drew in a wider circle of commentators who were not originally part of the dispute, but saw the engagement potential in analyzing it. Reaction videos, breakdown threads, and context explanations began multiplying across platforms. Each new analysis added another layer of interpretation, and each layer made it harder for casual observers to distinguish between what was originally said and what had been added afterward. The most significant shift during this phase was the emergence of a narrative about coordination. One side suggested that criticism was being systematically amplified by aligned voices. The other side suggested that defensive responses were being coordinated in the same way. Neither claim was conclusively proven within the discussion, but both gained traction because they provided structure to what otherwise looked like chaotic back-and-forth arguments. Once a conflict is framed as coordinated, it stops being viewed as a disagreement between individuals and starts being seen as a strategic battle between groups. That reframing dramatically increases emotional investment because audiences are no longer just watching opinions clash. They believe they are watching influence being exercised in real time. At the same time, the emotional tone of the discourse hardened. Earlier attempts at clarification or nuance were increasingly ignored in favor of sharper, more absolute statements. The algorithmic environment rewarded certainty, not complexity. Posts that framed things in black and white terms traveled further than those that tried to explain ambiguity. This incentivized escalation at every level. The shocking reveal moment in this stage is not a verified discovery, but rather the perception that the conflict had moved beyond surface-level disagreement. The audience began to feel that there was a hidden layer beneath what was publicly visible. Whether that was internal tension, strategic messaging, or suppressed context depended entirely on which side one was listening to. What makes this phase particularly volatile is that once people believe there is hidden information, every new detail becomes suspect. Even neutral statements are reinterpreted through the lens of suspicion. Even silence becomes meaningful. The absence of response is treated as confirmation of something unspoken. By the end of this escalation phase, the situation had fully transitioned from a dispute over statements into a battle over narrative control. Candace Owens' camp and Erika Kirk's camp were no longer just responding to each other. They were actively trying to shape how the entire story would be remembered by the public. And in that environment, the idea of a single truth becomes less important than which narrative can sustain attention longer, spread further, and feel more emotionally convincing to the audience watching it unfold. The tension currently unfolding between Candace Owens and Erika Kirk didn't appear overnight. It's the result of months, arguably years, of overlapping political influence, public perception battles, and growing mistrust within conservative media circles. At the center of this storm is the legacy of Charlie Kirk and the organization he built, Turning Point USA. For years, FUSA positioned itself as a dominant force in youth conservative activism in America, building massive online reach, campus influence, and high-profile political connections. Charlie Kirk became both the face and voice of that movement, shaping narratives, engaging in culture war debates, and building a highly loyal digital audience. Erika Kirk, as his wife, was often seen in a supportive background role. Publicly, she maintained a more private image, occasionally appearing in moments tied to family life or major events. But after Charlie's death, that public position changed dramatically. Erika stepped forward into a much more visible role, speaking publicly, engaging with media, and becoming a symbolic figure connected to FUSA's future direction. That shift alone became a major talking point online. Supporters saw it as strength in the face of tragedy, while critics began questioning timing, messaging, and the internal dynamics of TFUSA leadership transitions. The sudden increase in visibility also meant increased scrutiny, and with that scrutiny came speculation, commentary, and eventually controversy. Candace Owens, already a polarizing political commentator and former collaborator within conservative media spaces, has positioned herself as one of the most vocal critics questioning aspects of the official narratives surrounding events tied to TFUSA. Her commentary has consistently challenged internal decision-making, leadership structure, and what she describes as inconsistencies in public messaging. This is where the conflict begins to take shape, not in direct confrontation at first, but through public commentary, indirect statements, and escalating responses on social media platforms. What makes this situation particularly volatile is the overlap between personal relationships and political alliances. Many of the individuals involved are not just public figures but former colleagues, collaborators, and in some cases personal acquaintances. That means every statement carries multiple layers of interpretation: professional, personal, and ideological. As online discussions intensified, fans and critics began dissecting interviews, speeches, and past statements, trying to find contradictions or hidden meaning. Small details were amplified into larger narratives. Social media platforms like X, formerly Twitter, YouTube commentary channels, and podcast discussions became the primary battleground where opinions were formed and reinforced. In this environment, neutrality became increasingly rare. Most discussions quickly polarized into two camps: those defending Erika Kirk and TFUSA, and those aligning with Candace Owens' criticisms or at least entertaining her questions. Adding fuel to the situation were secondary commentators and influencers who entered the conversation, often reposting clips, adding speculation, or framing events in highly emotional language designed to attract engagement. Once this ecosystem formed, the situation became self-sustaining. Each new claim or response triggered another wave of reaction. It is within this highly charged environment that Erika Kirk's public remarks about Candace Owens, and Candace's responses to those remarks, began to escalate the situation from commentary into perceived personal conflict. What started as indirect critique slowly evolved into direct accusations of misrepresentation, media manipulation, and narrative distortion. Each side began addressing not just the original events, but also the way those events were being discussed publicly. As a result, the situation is no longer just about TFUSA or even Charlie Kirk's legacy. It has become a broader cultural flashpoint involving media trust, political loyalty, and the power of online narratives to shape real-world reputations. By the time the situation reaches its most intense phase, the conflict is no longer just about statements, interviews, or social media posts. It has evolved into something much bigger: a battle over narrative control, credibility, and who gets to define what the truth even is. The so-called final twist doesn't arrive as a single explosive document or undeniable piece of evidence. Instead, it emerges through a pattern that starts becoming impossible for observers to ignore: escalating legal pressure, increasingly coordinated public messaging, and a growing number of independent voices stepping in to challenge both sides. On one side, Candace Owens continues to insist that her commentary has been consistently misrepresented. She doubles down on the idea that her focus is not personal conflict, but structural accountability and transparency within influential political organizations. In her framing, the backlash she's receiving is not random. It is a response to uncomfortable questions that certain groups would prefer remain unasked. On the other side, Erika Kirk's position becomes increasingly defensive and emotionally charged. Her public responses emphasize protection of legacy, family boundaries, and resistance against what she describes as targeted online distortion campaigns. The messaging becomes sharper, more urgent, and more focused on drawing a clear line between criticism and what she considers coordinated character attacks. But what shifts everything in this final phase is not just what either woman says. It's what begins happening around them. Legal language starts entering the conversation more frequently. Words like defamation, discovery, and documentation begin appearing in public commentary and reaction breakdowns. Even without court rulings or formal outcomes, the mere presence of legal framing changes the tone of the entire discussion. What was once purely digital discourse now carries real-world consequences. At the same time, Secondary figures involved in the wider ecosystem begin to pull back or clarify previous statements. Some posts are edited, some claims are reworded, others are deleted entirely. This behavior adds a new layer of uncertainty, as audiences begin questioning which parts of the narrative were fully verified and which were amplified in the heat of online momentum. This is where the twist becomes psychologically more significant than factual. The audience starts realizing that the story they thought they were watching unfold in real time may have been fragmented, selectively presented, and interpreted through layers of bias from every direction. Even neutral observers begin shifting their tone. Instead of definitive statements, they start using cautious language, allegedly, reportedly, according to claims, and context unclear. That linguistic shift signals something important: the collapse of certainty. And then comes the cliffhanger moment. A new wave of online discussion begins circulating around the idea that more internal information may exist, but has not yet been publicly released. Not confirmed documents, not verified evidence, but the suggestion that there are additional layers to the story still behind closed doors. Whether this comes from legal anticipation, insider speculation, or simply internet rumor does not matter as much as its effect. It reignites the entire conversation. Audiences begin asking sharper questions. Was everything that has been presented so far only part of a much larger internal dispute? Are there communications, timelines, or records that have not yet been made public? And if so, who controls when, or if they ever come out? Candace Owens supporters interpret this moment as confirmation that further scrutiny is inevitable. Erika Kirk's supporters see it as another escalation of speculation that risks deepening harm and misinformation. Both sides become even more entrenched, and the gap between interpretations widens further. The most striking part of this cliffhanger is not certainty. It is instability. Nothing feels fully resolved. Every explanation feels temporary. Every conclusion feels subject to revision. And as the online ecosystem continues to churn through clips, commentary, and reaction videos, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This is no longer just a dispute between two public figures. It has become a long-running narrative war where every new development is instantly absorbed, reframed, and redebated before the dust from the previous one even settles. The final question left hanging is simple, but unresolved. Is this the end of the story, or just the moment right before the next, even bigger reveal? At this point, the situation has already moved far beyond a normal online controversy. What started as commentary, criticism, and response clips has now turned into a fast-moving narrative that keeps reshaping itself with every new post, interview, and reaction. And that's exactly why this story is still developing in real time. Every side of this debate believes they are reacting to facts, but the reality is that most people are consuming fragments, short clips, reposted statements, edited summaries, and commentary layered on top of commentary. That's how modern media cycles work now. The loudest version of the story often spreads faster than the complete one. So the real question for anyone watching this unfold is simple. How do you separate momentum from truth? Because once a narrative reaches this level of attention, it stops being controlled by the people in it and starts being controlled by the audience reacting to it. Every share, every comment, every reaction video adds another layer to the story, sometimes clarifying it, sometimes distorting it even further. That's why staying aware matters more than ever. Not just aware of what is being said, but how it is being said, who is saying it first, and what context might be missing in the versions that go viral. If you've followed this far, you already know this isn't a simple situation with a clean ending. It's an ongoing media cycle built on competing interpretations, emotional reactions, and high-stakes reputations on both sides. So here's where you come in. Stay informed, but stay critical. Watch the developments, but don't rush to conclusions based on fragments. Look at sources, compare perspectives, and be cautious of narratives that feel too complete too quickly. Because stories like this rarely end where they begin, and the next update could shift everything again. If you want to stay updated as this situation develops, make sure you're following closely, staying engaged, and watching how both sides continue to respond in real time. And if new information drops, it will likely reshape everything you think you understand right now. For now, the only certainty is this: the story is still unfolding.